Have you noticed how often in political debates these days, in news shows where they have a panel discussion, it seems there's very little actual debate, actual discussion of ideas or proposals, and there's a lot more interrupting of each other, shouting across each other, trying to shout the other one down, dominating the conversation, sometimes devolving into personal insults. Maybe you've noticed something similar even in your own family, that it's like we've forgotten how to disagree well. What's going on here? Where did all this come from? How did we get here? It's a little bit hard to answer that question because I think there's lots of factors that have gone into it. What I'd like to reflect on a bit today is a couple of trends in philosophy that I think are contributing to this, and maybe one or two things we might be able to do about it to, at least within our own sphere of influence, be a more positive influence and contributor to the conversation. These two philosophical trends are known as nihilism and relativism. To get a grasp of what these are, we have to go back quite a ways, back into the 1500s, when the French philosopher and mathematician René Descartes began seeking a way to put philosophy on what he called an indubitable first principle, a beginning point for all of the reflections that could not be doubted, indubitable. This is where he arrived at his famous cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Calling everything in doubt, Descartes realized the only thing that he could know for certain was that he was thinking, and this meant that he existed. Now he hoped that this would be the starting point for putting philosophy on a very sure footing. In doing this, Descartes moved from going out to seek truth, engaging reality around us, and discovering the meaning that's there in reality, to looking inward. We would call this a move from, in philosophical terms, the objective to the subjective. But turning inward into my own thoughts as it played out has actually made philosophy much more shaky, and quite the opposite of what Descartes seems to have set out to do. Over time, this led to the idea that there really is no meaning out there to be discovered in reality. That's what nihilism is. It comes from the Latin word meaning nothing. There's no meaning out there to be discovered. Or, stated a little bit more softly, if there's meaning out there to be discovered, we can't know it for certain. That's essentially what nihilism claims. That then leads to, if I want to have meaning, then I have to impose meaning on reality. So it's the meaning that I come up with and I impose on reality. This is what we call relativism. That's where you hear people say things like, well, that may be true for you, but it's not true for me. Or, you do you, I'll do me. This whole idea that everything is relative. I can impose my own meaning on reality, you can impose your meaning on reality, and everything is be fine. The problem is, what happens when the meaning you impose on reality and the meaning that I impose on reality are directly contrary or even contradictory to each other? What happens when you doing you runs smack into me doing me? How are we to settle these things? If there's no meaning out there to be discovered, or if we can't discover it, even if there is, on what ground do we have to stand on? How can we have a reasoned discussion and disagreement? What it ultimately comes down to is who can gain the most influence, and thus who can gain the most power. Now, I don't mean power here necessarily in the sense of physical force, or the power of the police or the military. That's one type of power. I suppose it could be used, but the type of power I have in mind here is much more subtle. It's more about influence. How many people can I reach with my ideas, the meaning that I impose on reality, and bring them around to thinking the same thing? That's the meaning that they impose on reality as well. Well, the way that I do that is by trying to gain influence. So I try to get together great social media posts. I get writers together that share a similar view of reality, and we create great compelling movies and TV shows and magazine articles and other types of literature and music that helps to spread these ideas. And the more people that we get to view these, the more that they'll start to share this, and thus we have more influence and thus power to impose our meaning on reality and to get others to impose the same meaning on reality. Now what that means is when there's a disagreement, the only way to settle it is through a power struggle. And when that comes down to a debate, that is going to look like interrupting the other person, dominating the conversation, trying to get in the last word. It might even devolve into personal attacks and shouting matches, because that's how I can, in a debate, in that particular set of circumstances, gain more influence and more power. If I'm the one doing all the talking, then everybody's going to hear my ideas and be more likely to impose the same meaning on reality. This is probably not, I'm convinced, this is not an exhaustive answer to the question of how did we get here, but I think it points to something that I find deeply troubling. Because if indeed we can't figure out how to disagree well, it's going to be difficult for us to live together in society. I mean, really, if we can't agree on what is good and what is bad, what it means to be human, how are we going to really be able to live together as a society? It's going to be very challenging. So what can we do to counteract the ways that nihilism and relativism have sort of permeated our culture and they've just become part of the air that we breathe? I would suggest a couple of things. One is we really need to get to know what the church actually teaches and believes. These are drawn on reality, not subjective but objective reality. Some of it God has revealed and made known to us, some of it by reflecting on the nature of things. If I assume that there actually is reality out there and it has meaning and I can actually come to some understanding of it, by reflecting on the nature of things, I can come to understand certain truths. In Catholic thought, we call that natural law. In other words, I discover that there's an order to the way that things work. And by looking at their nature, how they work, I can at least get some insight into this. So coming to understand what we believe and why, reflecting on that regularly, surrounding ourselves with podcasts or reading or things we can listen to or watch that help us to gather that together and reflect on it and continually reflect on it, allows what we believe to be more and more the way in which we operate. It puts us much more in touch with reality. So that's the first thing. Build my own understanding of what we believe and why. A second thing is then, when I'm in conversation with others, rather than just trying to articulate for them the truth and come up with better responses to objections to the truth, and do a sort of defense of the faith. That's good. We should be prepared to do that if we have the opportunity. But more often than not, it's more effective to simply share, this is my experience of living out what I believe. This is how it makes my life better, or how it makes it easier for me to cope with suffering, or how it clarifies what I really need to make a priority in my life and what's not so important. These are things that almost everybody I meet struggle with. I know I struggle with them. And so if I can share my experience of how living what I believe and having grown in that understanding of why we believe it and how it applies to my life makes a positive difference for me. That then invites the other person, well, I tried it in the laboratory of my life, maybe you should try it in the laboratory of your life. See if it works. This can be some ways of inviting people to adopt another perspective, to step away from this sense that the meaning in reality is only that which we impose on it, even though we don't usually articulate it that way to ourselves. We just kind of have this thought that's like, oh, well, you do you and I'll do me and it'll be fine. Well, maybe, but maybe there's more to it than this. So this invites them to reflect on that experience. Is the way that we're living, is this you do you and me do me, is it really working? Is it not leading to disagreements that we seem unable to solve? And do we need to perhaps look outside ourselves to see what else might be out there to help us in coming to a better understanding of what's really going on and how we really ought to live? So this invitation for people to reflect on their own experience as well can lead them to at least start questioning, is this thought that everything is relative? Is that really a plausible claim based on my experience? Should I perhaps want to question that And that then can open up the invitation to maybe some good reading that might prepare them for the Catholic faith, or more reading about the Catholic faith. I'll have to give some suggestions of what that reading might be at some point in time. I didn't have a chance to gather all that together. I was just thinking about this, thinking about how often we see kind of shouting matches on TV, whether it's a presidential debate or some news discussion panel. Maybe it's even in our own families. And what are some of the things that contributed to this? So I wanted to offer this as some food for thought. I hope you found this helpful. If you did, feel free to subscribe to my channel and share this with others. God bless.